Okay, class, we're going to try to wrap up this chapter on the living cell and talk about energy transduction and replication or reproduction of cells. These are the two most essential functions of the cell. The cell has to be able to obtain energy in some way in order to reproduce or replicate itself. So if you had a to-do list, these two would be right at the top. Now, energy transduction in life, what we might call metabolism in general. Both single cellular and multicellular organisms have to have a source of energy, some source of fuel. Now, if you're a plant or a photosynthetic bacterium or algae, you might obtain your energy initially from the sun. That is, you may be a primary producer or what we call a phototroph using photosynthesis. Or there are some life sources that actually use some non-carbon-based chemicals as an energy source. And we'll not talk about those because most of the life forms that we are familiar with use a carbon-based energy source, such as glucose, as their energy source. And of course, there may be other related molecules, such as proteins and lipids, that we use for energy sources. And if you're into nutrition, you may have heard that certain amino acids are either ketogenic or glucogenic. And basically what that means is that we metabolize them in certain ways to bring them into a common pathway in which glucose is metabolized. And so we will focus on the metabolism of glucose. How is glucose metabolized to obtain energy? And we will see that there are two significant stages to the metabolism of glucose. The first stage we call glycolysis, which brings glucose to a molecule called either pyruvate or lactate. Basically, in glycolysis, a 6-carbon molecule, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, is split into 2 3-carbon molecules, either pyruvate or lactate. And in the process we call respiration, we will see that the 3-carbon molecules, like pyruvate, are further broken down into carbon dioxide and water. And in each of these processes, we extract energy that we need to do other types of work. Now, that energy that we extract is first converted to a molecule called ATP. ATP, in a sense, is the energy currency. So in glycolysis, we will see that we form so many ATP molecules. And in respiration, we form so many ATP molecules. Actually, we'll form many more ATP molecules in that second respiration phase. But this is the structure of adenosine triphosphate, which we commonly call ATP. Now, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of cells, and there is a net production of only two ATPs in glycolysis. Now, the drawing to the right shows you the sequence of reactions. You don't really need to worry about it, except you'll notice that as you begin, you have glucose, which they have 6 of these circles that represent 6 carbons, and it's broken up into 2 3-carbon molecules at the end of this stage, and further, and to the right, we saw a continuation of glycolysis in which the molecule is converted to pyruvic acid or pyruvate. And in some cases, lactate. And you've probably heard, if you're into exercise, you've probably heard of lactic acid or lactate. It's a similar molecule to pyruvate. So this is glycolysis. There's a related process called fermentation, in which glucose is converted to ethanol. Fermentation follows the same set of reactions, except right at the end, there's an additional step in which you form ethanol instead of pyruvate. Respiration, which we can also call aerobic metabolism, occurs in the mitochondria. Remember those furnaces, those places where the final stages of metabolism occur. In aerobic respiration, the pyruvate is converted to carbon dioxide and water, the carbon dioxide and water which we exhale. This phase of metabolism is much more efficient in the production of ATP. As you can see, the total is 36 to 38. And if there's only 2 in the first part of glycolysis, that means 34 to 36 ATPs are formed in this aerobic phase of metabolism. There's another molecule that we form in many reactions called NADH. I won't give you the name of it, but it's another high energy molecule, which actually is the molecule that reacts with oxygen to convert oxygen to water, which is the water vapor that we exhale. We breathe in oxygen, O2, and we exhale water plus carbon dioxide. This process is also called the Krebs cycle. And shown to the right is this complete Krebs cycle. And again, it's to a non-biochemist, it looks really confusing. But at the very top, we start with pyruvate. We enter this, and the only molecule that I would draw your attention to is one called citrate, because that's citric acid, and you may have heard of citric acid. But anyway, this is the sequence of reactions in aerobic respiration, or what is called the Krebs cycle. Now, if you're a plant, you can also obtain energy directly from the sunlight in photosynthesis. This is the harnessing of electromagnetic radiation. And remember, if you had the first semester with me, we abbreviate electromagnetic radiation as HNU, and this energy from the sun is used to drive the formation of glucose from carbon dioxide and water. This is essentially the reverse of aerobic respiration. So for photosynthesis, if you just wrote the net reaction, you would say energy from the sun, HNU, plus carbon dioxide plus water goes to this hydrate of carbon, glucose, plus oxygen. So glucose and oxygen are the products of photosynthesis, whereas in aerobic respiration, which we just talked about, you switch the reaction around so that you have glucose plus oxygen being converted back to carbon dioxide and water, plus now energy is released or is harnessed as ATP molecules. So basically, the photosynthesis and aerobic respiration work together. Energy from the sun is ultimately converted to ATP, and this ATP is what living cells use to drive all of the types of work that they must do. A key to photosynthesis are the chloroplasts, these structures that contain pigments. One of these types of pigments is called chlorophyll, and chlorophyll will absorb visible light in the red and the blue region. It actually reflects light in the middle region of the spectrum, the yellows and greens, which is why plants oftentimes look yellow and green. And in harnessing this energy, you will form ATP and NADPH, a related molecule to NADH, in photosynthesis. And that ATP formed in photosynthesis is used to produce glucose, which the plant itself metabolizes as an energy source. And of course, then we consume the plant and we obtain the glucose from the plant as our energy source. So everything is working together. Now, in addition to the basic need of a living cell to obtain energy from some energy source, whether it be the sun in photosynthesis or from a fuel molecule such as glucose, another very basic function of a cell is to reproduce, because if there's only one copy of the cell and it can't replicate itself, then when that cell wears out and just dies or gets stepped on or whatever, then that life form is over with. So the cell has to be able to reproduce. Now, if we think of our bodies, a lot of our cells have to be able to replicate themselves as a result of, say, injury, for example. When we get sunburn, our skin cells are always sloughing off when we're making new endothelial cells. Some of our cells have been in our bodies for a long, long time, like our muscle cells and our nerve cells, because they're such long cells that once they're there, we just can't make new copies of them very easily. But other cells, bone cells, epithelial cells, we have to constantly make new ones of these as a result of just growth and injury. So when cells divide, a very important step is that we have to make copies of the blueprint, the genetic information, the DNA, the chromosomes. Okay? So this is our next topic of discussions. When cells divide, how do they make copies of the chromosomes, the genetic information? Now, most of our cells in our bodies are what we call diploid. Diploid means that the chromosomes come in pairs. And we say that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. You've heard of 23andMe. 23 pairs of chromosomes in a typical human cells. Most of our cells are diploid. However, there are some that are haploid. That means that they only have one copy. Instead of pairs, the chromosomes come in individuals. Those haploid cells are what we call gamete cells. They are the sperm cells in males and the ova or egg cells in females. So it's very important for reproduction of the entire organism, our human being. So we have to have a process, and we have to understand how we make these gamete cells. Okay. Now, before going to the next slide, you might wonder about 23 pairs of chromosomes. We're going to talk about genetics in the next chapter, but we have our chromosomes come in pairs because one chromosome will come from the father and one will come from the mother, and they each have genes. Some genes are dominant, some are recessive, so we'll get into that. But you might wonder, is 23 a good number to have? Well, there's no rhyme or reason, hardly, for the number of pairs of chromosomes. There are some ants that have only 2 pairs of chromosomes. We have 23. A horse has 64 pairs of chromosomes. Some rats have more than 90 pairs of chromosomes. So the number of pairs really doesn't seem to have anything to do with how developed the organism is. So when a cell divides or splits into 2 new daughter cells, one of the things that has to happen is that a copy must be made of the chromosomes. However many chromosomes there have to be sort of replicated so that one set of chromosomes can go with one daughter cell and the other with the other daughter cell. This process is called mitosis. Mitosis for cell division. So copying the chromosomes. And when the chromosomes are copied, they must be moved to 2 different sides of the cell, what are called 2 different poles of the cell. A membrane, a nuclear membrane, must be formed around each of these new sets of chromosomes, and then the cell will divide. Now, this is shown in the graphic to the right. In this graphic, this cell has 2 pairs of chromosomes originally. And I'll point out in my little highlighted red dot here that this darker blue and this lighter blue are 1 pair of chromosomes. And likewise, this one and this one are another pair of chromosomes in the original cell. So in one of the first steps in mitosis, they are replicated so that now you see that this 1 chromosome is now double. This one is double, and likewise, this one is double, and this one is double. Those chromosomes, now that they're doubled or replicated, sort of line up, and then they're pulled apart in a process that involves something called spindle fibers. And they're pulled to 2 different sides or 2 different poles, and then the nuclear membrane forms, and the cell divides to form 2 new daughter cells. Now, interestingly, the spindle fibers are made of proteins like those in the cytoskeleton that we talked about in the previous slide. There are proteins called kinesin and dicein. Meiosis is a similar process, actually it's a little more complicated, and occurs in forming gamete cells. Remember, gamete cells are those cells involved in sexual reproduction, and they have to be haploid, that is, have only a single copy of all of the genetic information. So how does this work? Well, this works similarly, except it's sort of like a 2-step process. First, if we show a cell, an original cell that has only 1 pair of chromosomes, just to make the graphic simpler, 1 pair of chromosomes, that first it has to double to form, that is to replicate those chromosomes, so that now there are now 2 copies of this pair of chromosomes, and we've color-coded them red and blue so that you can tell them apart. So that's sort of like the first step. And then this cell will divide so that one pair of chromosomes becomes one daughter cell and another becomes another daughter cell. So this is sort of like mitosis so far. But then there's a second step in meiosis, that is the forming gamete cells, in which the two chromosomes in an individual pair of chromosomes, that is the two chromosome strands, are separated into two new gamete cells. So you can see in the following that from one initial cell, you can form 4 different possible gamete cells having the individual single strands or single chromosomes. Now the gamete cells then will be either a sperm cell or an egg cell, and when they combine to form a fertilized egg, they will each of these gamete cells will be bringing one chromosome, which then pair up to form a chromosome pair. Now, in this example, there's only one chromosome pair, but in humans, there would be 23 chromosome pairs that would form in the fertilized egg. Okay, so that's the chapter on the living cell. Again, we'll pause to have a little quiz. Then you can have some access to some of the study notes. Okay, and then we'll move on to the next chapter after this. See ya.